Philebus. Well then, Protarchus, consider just what the thesis is that you are now taking over from Philebus, and what our thesis is that you are going to argue against. If you find that you do not agree with it, shall we summarize them both? Yes, let's do that. Philebus holds that what is good for all creatures is to enjoy themselves, to be pleased and delighted, and whatever else goes together with that kind of thing. We contend that not these, but knowing, understanding, and remembering, and what belongs with them, right opinion and true calculations, are better than pleasure and more agreeable to all who can attain them, those who can get the maximum benefit possible from having them, both those now alive and future generations. Isn't that how we present our respective positions, Philebus? Absolutely, Socrates. Do you agree, Protarchus, to take over this thesis that's now offered you? I'm afraid I have to. Fair Philebus has given up on us. So we must do everything possible to get through somehow to the truth about these matters. We certainly must. Come on then. Here is a further point we need to agree on. What is that? That each of us will be trying to prove some possession or state of the soul to be the one that can render life happy for all human beings. Isn't that so? Quite so. You that it is pleasure, we that it is knowledge. That is so. What if it should turn out that there is another possession, better than either of them? Would the result not be that, if it turns out to be more closely related to pleasure, we will both lose out against the life that firmly possesses that, but the life of pleasure will defeat the life of knowledge? Yes. And if it is closer to knowledge, then knowledge wins over pleasure and pleasure loses. Do you accept this as agreed? It seems agreeable to me. But also to Philebus. Philebus, what do you say? To my mind, pleasure wins and always will win, no matter what. But you must see for yourself, Protarchus. But now you have handed over the argument to us, Philebus, you can no longer control the agreements we make with Socrates, nor our disagreements. You are right. I absolve myself of all responsibility, and now call the goddess herself as my witness. We will be your witnesses too, that you did say what you are now saying. As to what follows, Socrates, let us go ahead and try to push through to a conclusion, with Philebus's consent or not. We must do our best, making our start with the goddess herself. This fellow claims that though she is called Aphrodite, her truest name is Pleasure. Certainly. I always feel a more than human dread over what names to use for the gods. It surpasses the greater fear. So now I address Aphrodite by whatever title pleases her. But as to pleasure, I know that it is complex and, just as I said, we must make it our starting point and consider carefully what sort of nature it has. If one just goes by the name, it is one single thing, but in fact it comes in many forms that are in some way even quite unlike each other. Think about it. We say that a debauched person gets pleasure, as well as that a sober-minded person takes pleasure in his very sobriety. Again, we say that a fool, though full of foolish opinions and hopes, gets pleasure, but likewise a wise man takes pleasure in his wisdom. But surely anyone who said in either case that these pleasures are like one another would rightly be regarded as a fool. Well, yes, Socrates, the pleasures come from opposite things, but they are not at all opposed to one another. For how could pleasure not be of all things most like pleasure? How could that thing not be most like itself? Just as colour is most like colour? Really, you surprise me. Colours certainly won't differ in so far as every one of them is a colour, but we all know that black is not only different from white, but is in fact its very opposite, and shape is most like shape in the same way, for shape is all one in genus, but some of its parts are absolutely opposite to one another, and others differ in innumerable ways, and we will discover many other such cases. So don't rely on this argument which makes a unity of all the things that are most opposed. I am afraid we will find there are some pleasures that are contrary to others. Maybe so, but how will this harm our thesis? Because you call these unlike things, we will say, by a different name, for you say that all pleasant things are good. Now, no one contends that pleasant things are not pleasant, but while most of them are bad but some good, as we hold, you nevertheless call them all good, even though you would admit that they are unlike one another if someone pressed the point. What is the common element in the good and bad pleasures that allows you to call them all good? What are you saying, Socrates? Do you think anyone will agree to this who begins by laying it down that pleasure is the good? Do you think he will accept it when you say that some pleasures are good but others are bad? But you will grant that they are unlike each other and that some are opposites, not in so far as they are pleasures. But really, Protarchus, this takes us back to the same old point. Are we then to say that pleasure does not differ from pleasure, but all are alike? Don't the examples just given make the slightest impression on us? Are we to behave and speak in just the same way as those who are the most incompetent, and at the same time newcomers in such discussions? What way do you mean? This. Suppose I imitate you and dare to say in defense of my thesis that the most unlike thing is of all things most like the most unlike. Then I could say the same thing as you did, but this would make us look quite childish, and our discussion would founder on the rock. Let us therefore set it afloat again. Perhaps we can reach a mutual accommodation if each side accepts a similar stance toward its candidate. Just tell me how. Let me be the one questioned in turn by you. About what? About wisdom, knowledge, understanding, and all the things that I laid down at the beginning as good when I tried to answer the question, what is good? Won't my answer suffer the same consequences as your thesis did? How so? Taken all together, the branches of knowledge will seem to be a plurality, and some will seem quite unlike others. And if some of them turn out in some way actually to be opposites, would I be a worthy partner in a discussion if I dreaded this so much that I would deny that one kind of knowledge can be unlike another? That way our whole discussion would come to an end like that of a fairy tale, with us kept safe and sound through some absurdity. We must not let that happen, except the part about our being kept safe and sound. But I am rather pleased by the fact that our theses are on the same footing. So let it be agreed that there can be many and unlike kinds of pleasures, but also many and different kinds of knowledge. Well then, let us not cover up the difference between your good and mine, Protarchus, but put it right in the middle and brave the possibility that, when put to a closer scrutiny, it will come to light whether pleasure should be called the good, or wisdom, or yet a third thing. For we are not contending here out of love of victory, for my suggestion to win, or for yours. We ought to act together as allies in support of the truest one. We certainly ought to. Let us then give even stronger support to our principle by an agreement. What principle? The one that creates difficulties for everyone, for some willingly, for some sometimes against their will. Explain this more clearly. It is this principle that has turned up here, which somehow has an amazing nature, for that the many are one and the one many are amazing statements, and can easily be disputed, whichever side of the two one may want to defend. Do you mean this in the sense that someone says that I, Protarchus, am one by nature, but then also says that there are many me's, and even contrary ones, when he treats me, who am one and the same, as tall and short, heavy and light, and endless other such things? You, dear Protarchus, are speaking about those puzzles about the one and many that have become commonplace. They are agreed by everybody, so to speak, to be no longer even worth touching. They are considered childish and trivial, but a serious impediment to argument if one takes them on. No more worthy is the following quibble. When someone who first distinguishes a person's limbs and parts asks your agreement that all these parts are identical with that unity, but then exposes you to ridicule because of the monstrosities you have to admit that the one is many and indefinitely many, and again that the many are only one thing. But what other kinds of such puzzles with respect to the same principle do you have in mind, Socrates, that have not yet admittedly become commonplace? When, my young friend, the one is not taken from the things that come to be or perish, as we have just done in our example, for that is where the sort of one belongs that we were just discussing, which we agreed is not worthy of scrutiny. But when someone tries to posit man as one, or ox as one, or the beautiful as one, and the good as one, zealous concern with divisions of these unities and the like gives rise to controversy. In what sense? Firstly, whether one ought to suppose that there are any such unities truly in existence. Then again, how they are supposed to be, whether each one of them is always one and the same, admitting neither of generation nor of destruction, and whether it remains most definitely one and the same, even though it is afterwards found again among the things that come to be and are unlimited, so that it finds itself as one and the same in one and many things at the same time. And must it be treated as dispersed and multiplied, or as entirely separated from itself, which would seem most impossible of all? It is these problems of the one and many, but not those others, Protarchus, that cause all sorts of difficulties if they are not properly settled, but promise progress if they are. Is this the first task we should try our hands at right now, Socrates? So I would say, at least. Take it, then, that we all here are agreed with you about this. As for Philebus, it might be best not to bother him with questions any further, but let sleeping dogs lie. Quite so. Now, where should we make our entry into that complex and wide-ranging battle about this controversial issue? Is it not best to start here? Where? By making the point that it is through discourse that the same thing flits around, becoming one and many in all sorts of ways, in whatever it may be that it is said at any time, both long ago and now. And this will never come to an end, nor has it just begun, but it seems to me that this is an immortal and ageless condition that comes to us with discourse. Whoever among the young first gets a taste of it is as pleased as if he had found a treasure of wisdom. He is quite beside himself with pleasure, and revels in moving every statement, now turning it to one side and rolling it all up into one, then again unrolling it and dividing it up. He thereby involves first and foremost himself in confusion, but then also whatever others happen to be nearby, be they younger or older, or of the same age, sparing neither his father nor his mother nor anyone else who might listen to him. He would almost try it on other creatures, not only on human beings, since he would certainly not spare any foreigner, if only he could find an interpreter somewhere. Careful, Socrates, don't you see what a crowd we are, and that we are all young? And are you not afraid that we will gang up against you with Philebus if you insult us? Still, we know what you want to say, and if there are some ways and means to remove this kind of disturbance from our discussion in a peaceful way, and to show us a better solution to the problem, then just go ahead, and we will follow you as best we can. For the present question is no mean thing, Socrates. It certainly is not, my boys, as Philebus is wont to address you. Indeed, there is not, nor could there be, any way that is finer than the one I have always admired, although it has often escaped me and left me behind, alone and helpless. What is this way? Let us have it. It is not very difficult to describe, but extremely difficult to use, for everything in any field of art that has ever been discovered has come to light because of this. See what way I have in mind. Please do tell us. It is a gift of the gods to men, or so it seems to me, hurled down from heaven by some Prometheus, along with a most dazzling fire. And the people of old, superior to us and living in closer proximity to the gods, have bequeathed us this tale, that whatever is said to be consists of one and many, having in its nature limit and unlimitedness. Since this is the structure of things, we have to assume that there is in each case always one form for every one of them, and we must search for it, as we will indeed find it there. And once we have grasped it, we must look for two, as the case would have it, or if not, for three or some other number. And we must treat every one of those further unities in the same way, until it is not only established of the original unit that it is one, many, and unlimited, but also how many kinds it is. For we must not grant the form of the unlimited to the plurality before we know the exact number of every plurality that lies between the unlimited and the one. Only then is it permitted to release each kind of unity into the unlimited and let it go. The gods, as I have said, have left us this legacy of how to inquire and learn and teach one another. But nowadays the clever ones among us make a one haphazardly and a many faster or slower than they should. They go straight from the one to the unlimited and omit the intermediates. It is these, however, that make all the difference as to whether we are engaged with each other in dialectical or only in eristic discourse. Some of what you said I think I understand in some way, Socrates, but of some I still need further clarification. What I mean is clear in the case of letters, and you should take your clue from them, since they were part of your own education. How so? The sound that comes out of the mouth is one for each and every one of us, but then it is also unlimited in number. No doubt. Neither of these two facts alone yet makes us knowledgeable, neither that we know its unlimitedness nor its unity. But if we know how many kinds of vocal sounds there are, and what their nature is, that makes every one of us literate. Very true. And the very same thing leads to the knowledge of music. How is that? Sound is also the unit in this art, just as it was in writing. Yes, right. We should posit low and high pitch as two kinds, and equal pitch as a third kind, or what would you say? Just that. But you could not yet claim knowledge of music if you knew only this much, though if you were ignorant even about that, you would be quite incompetent in these matters, as one might say. Certainly. But you will be competent, my friend, once you have learned how many intervals there are in high pitch and low pitch, what character they have, by what notes the intervals are defined, and the kinds of combinations they form, all of which our forebears have discovered and left to us, their successors, together with the names of these modes of harmony. And again the motions of the body display other and similar characteristics of this kind, which they say should be measured by numbers and called rhythms and meters. So at the same time they have made us realize that every investigation should search for the one and many. For when you have mastered these things in this way, then you have acquired expertise there, and when you have grasped the unity of any of the other things there are, you have become wise about that. The boundless multitude, however, in any and every kind of subject, leaves you in boundless ignorance and makes you count for nothing and amount to nothing, since you have never worked out the amount and number of anything at all. For my part, I think that Socrates has explained all this very well, Philebus. I agree as far as this question itself goes, but of what use is all this talk to us, and what is its purpose? Philebus is right, Protarchus, when he asks us this question. Good, so please answer him. I will do so when I have gone a little further into the subject matter. Just as someone who has got hold of some unity or other should not, as we were saying, immediately look for the unlimited kind, but first look for some number, so the same holds for the reverse case. For if he is forced to start out with the unlimited, then he should not head straight for the one, but should in each case grasp some number that determines every plurality whatever, and from all of those finally reach the one. Let us again make use of letters to explain what this means. In what way? The way some god or god-inspired man discovered that vocal sound is unlimited, as tradition in Egypt claims for a certain deity called Theoth. He was the first to discover that the vowels in that unlimited variety are not one but several, and again that there are others that are not voiced but make some kind of noise, and that they too have a number. As a third kind of letters he established the ones we now call mute. After this he further subdivided the ones without sound or mutes down to every single unit. In the same fashion he also dealt with the vowels and the intermediates until he found out the number for each one of them, and then he gave all of them together the name letter. And as he realized that none of us could gain any knowledge of a single one of them, taken by itself without understanding them all, he considered that the one link that somehow unifies them all, and called it the art of literacy. Protarchus understood this even better than what came before, at least how it hangs together, but I still find that this explanation now suffers from the same defect as your earlier one. You are wondering again what the relevance of it all is, Philebus. Right. That is what I and Protarchus have been wanting to see for quite a while. But have you not already under your nose what you both, as you say, have long wanted to see? How could that be? Did we not embark on an investigation of knowledge and pleasure to find out which of the two is preferable? Yes, indeed. And we do say that each of them is one. Right. This is the very point in question to which our preceding discussion obliges us to give answer, to show how each of them is one and many, and how instead of becoming unlimited straight away, each one of them acquires some definite number before it becomes unlimited. Socrates has plunged us into a considerable problem, Philebus, by leading us around, I don't know how, in some kind of circle. But make up your mind which of us should answer the present question. It would seem quite ridiculous that I, who had volunteered to take over the thesis from you as your successor, should now hand it back to you because I don't have an answer to this question. But it would be even more ridiculous if neither of us could answer it. So what do you think we should do? Socrates seems to be asking whether there are kinds of pleasures or not, and how many there are, and what sort they are, and the same set of questions applies to knowledge. You speak the truth, son of Callias. Unless we are able to do this for every kind of unity, similarity, sameness, and their opposite, in the way that our recent discussion has indicated, none of us will ever turn out to be any good at anything. I am afraid that this is so. But while it is a great thing for the wise man to know everything, the second best is not to be mistaken about oneself, it seems to me. What prompts me to say that at this point? I will tell you. You, Socrates, have granted this meeting to all of us, and yourself to boot, in order to find out what is the best of all human possessions. Now, Philebus advocated that it is pleasure, amusement, enjoyment, and whatever else there is of this kind. You, on the contrary, denied this for all of them, but rather proposed those other goods we willingly and with good reason keep reminding ourselves of, so that they can be tested as they are lying side by side in our memory. You claim, it seems, that the good that should by right be called superior to pleasure, at least, is reason, as well as knowledge, intelligence, science, and everything that is akin to them, which must be obtained, rather than Philebus's candidates. Now, after both these conflicting positions have been set up against each other, we threatened you in jest that we would not let you go home before the deliberation of these questions had reached its satisfactory limit. But since you made a promise and committed yourself to us, we therefore insist, like children, that there is no taking back a gift properly given. So give up this way of turning against us in the discussion here. What way are you talking about? Your way of plunging us into difficulties and repeating questions to which we have at present no proper answer to give you. But we should not take it that the aim of our meeting is universal confusion. If we cannot solve the problem, you must do it, for you promised. It is up to you to decide whether for this purpose you need to divide off different kinds of pleasure and knowledge, or can leave that out, if you are able and willing to show some other way to settle the issues of our controversy. At least there is no longer anything terrible in store for poor me, since you said it this way, for the clause, if you are willing, takes away all further apprehension. In addition, some memory has come to my mind that one of the gods seems to have sent me to help us. How is that, and what about? It is a doctrine that once upon a time I heard in a dream, or perhaps I was awake, that I remember now concerning pleasure and knowledge, that neither of the two is the good, but that there is some third thing which is different from and superior to both of them. But if we can clearly conceive now that this is the case, then pleasure has lost its bid for victory, for the good could no longer turn out to be identical with it. Right? Right. So we will not have to worry any longer, I think, about the division of the kinds of pleasure, but further progress will show this more clearly. Very well said. Just push on. There are some small matters we ought to agree on first, though. What are they? Whether the good is necessarily bound to be perfect or not perfect. But surely it must be the most perfect thing of all, Socrates. Further, must the good be sufficient? How could it fail to be that? This is how it is superior to everything else there is. Now, this point, I take it, is most necessary to assert of the good, that everything that has any notion of it hunts for it and desires to get hold of it and secure it for its very own, caring nothing for anything else except for what is connected with the acquisition of some good. There is no way of denying this. So let us put the life of pleasure and the life of knowledge on trial, and reach some verdict by looking at them separately. In what way do you mean? Let there be neither any knowledge in a life of pleasure, nor any pleasure in that of knowledge. For if either of the two is good, then it must have no need of anything in addition. But if one or the other should turn out to be lacking anything, then this can definitely no longer be the real good we are looking for. How could it be? So, shall we then use you as our test case to try both of them? By all means. Then answer me. Go ahead. Would you find it acceptable to live your whole life in enjoyment of the greatest pleasures? Why, certainly. And would you see yourself in need of anything else if you had secured this altogether? In no way. But look, might you not have some need of knowledge, intelligence, and calculation, or anything else that is related to them? How so? If I had pleasure, I would have all in all. And living like that, you can enjoy the greatest pleasures throughout your life? Why should I not? Since you would not be in possession of either reason, memory, knowledge, or true opinion, must you not be in ignorance, first of all, about this very question, whether you were enjoying yourself or not, given that you were devoid of any kind of intelligence? Necessarily. Moreover, due to lack of memory, it would be impossible for you to remember that you ever enjoyed yourself, and for any pleasure to survive from one moment to the next, since it would leave no memory. But, not possessing right judgment, you would not realize that you are enjoying yourself even while you do, and, being unable to calculate, you could not figure out any future pleasures for yourself. You would thus not live a human life, but the life of a mollusk, or of one of those creatures in shells that live in the sea. Is this what would happen, or can we think of any other consequences beside these? How could we? But is this a life worth choosing? Socrates, this argument has left me absolutely speechless for the moment. Even so, let us not give in to weakness. Let us in turn rather inspect the life of reason. What kind of life do you have in mind? Whether any one of us would choose to live in possession of every kind of intelligence, reason, knowledge, and memory of all things, while having no part, neither large nor small, of pleasure or pain, living in total insensitivity of anything of that kind. To me, at least, neither of these two forms of life seems worthy of choice, nor would it to anyone else, I presume. But what about a combination of both, Protarchus, a life that results from a mixture of the two? You mean a mixture of pleasure with reason and intelligence? Right, those are the ingredients I mean. Everybody would certainly prefer this life to either of the other two without exception. Do we realize what the upshot of this new development in our discussion is? Certainly, that of the three lives offered to us, two are not sufficient or worthy of choice for either man or animal. As far as they are concerned, is it then not clear at least that neither the one nor the other contain the good, since otherwise it would be sufficient, perfect, and worthy of choice for any of the plants and animals that can sustain them throughout their lifetime? And if anyone among us should choose otherwise, then he would do so involuntarily, in opposition to what is by nature truly choice-worthy, from ignorance or some unfortunate necessity. It certainly looks that way. Enough has been said, it seems to me, to prove that Philebus's goddess and the good cannot be regarded as one. Nor is your reason the good, Socrates, and the same complaint applies to it. It may apply to my reason, Philebus, but certainly not to the true, the divine reason, I should think. It is in quite a different condition. But now I am not arguing that reason ought to get first prize over and against the combined life. We have rather to look and make up our minds about the second prize, how to dispose of it. One of us may want to give credit for the combined life to reason, making it responsible, the other to pleasure. Thus neither of the two would be the good, but it could be assumed that one or the other of them is its cause. But I would be even more ready to contend against Philebus that whatever the ingredient in the mixed life may be that makes it choice-worthy and good, reason is more closely related to that thing and more like it than pleasure. And if this can be upheld, neither first nor second prize could really ever be claimed for pleasure. She will in fact not even get as much as third prize, if we can put some trust in my insight for now. By now it seems to me indeed that pleasure has been defeated, as if knocked down by your present argument, Socrates. In her fight for victory she has fallen, and as for reason, we may say that it wisely did not compete for first prize, for it would have suffered the same fate. But if pleasure were also deprived of second prize, she would definitely be somewhat dishonoured in the eyes of her own lovers, nor would she seem as fair to them as before. What then? Had we not better leave her alone now, rather than subject her to the most exacting test, and give her pain by such an examination? You talk nonsense, Socrates. Why? Because I said the impossible, giving pain to pleasure? Not only that, but because you don't realize that not one among us would let you go before you have carried the discussion of these questions to its end. Oh dear, Protarchus, then a long discussion lies ahead of us, and not exactly an easy one either at this point, for it seems that in the battle about the second prize for reason, a different device will be needed, different armament, as it were, from that used in our previous discussion, though it may partly be the same. Are we to proceed? Of course. Let us be very careful about the starting point we take. What kind of starting point? Let us make a division of everything that actually exists now in the universe into two kinds, or if this seems preferable, into three. Could you explain on what principle? By taking up some of what has been said before. Like what? We agreed earlier that the God had revealed a division of what is into the unlimited and the limit. Certainly. Let us now take these as two of the kinds, while treating the one that results from the mixture of these two as our third kind. But I must look like quite a fool with my distinctions into kinds and enumerations. What are you driving at? That we seem to be in need of yet a fourth kind. Tell us what it is. Look at the cause of this combination of those two together, and posit it as my fourth kind in addition to those three. Might you not also be in need of a fifth kind that provides for their separation? Perhaps, but I don't think so, at least for now. But if it turns out that I need it, I gather you will bear with me if I should search for a fifth kind. Gladly. Let us take up three of the four, and since we observe that two of them both are split up and dispersed into many, let's make an effort to collect those into a unity again in order to study how each of them is in fact one and many. If you could explain all that more clearly, I might be able to follow you. What I mean is this. The two kinds are the ones I referred to just now, the unlimited and what has limit. That the unlimited in a way is many I will try to explain now. The treatment of what has limit will have to wait a little longer. Let it wait. Attention then. The matter I am asking you to attend to is difficult and controversial, but attend to it nevertheless. Check first in the case of the hotter and the colder whether you can conceive of a limit, or whether the more and less do not rather reside in these kinds, and while they reside in them, do not permit the attainment of any end, for once an end has been reached, they will both have been ended as well. Very true. We are agreed then that the hotter and the colder always contain the more and less. Quite definitely. Our argument forces us to conclude that these things never have an end, and since they are endless, they turn out to be entirely unlimited. Quite strongly so, Socrates. You have grasped this rather well, Protarchus, and remind me rightly with your pronouncement of strongly that it and equally its counterpart gently are of the same calibre as the more or less. Wherever they apply, they prevent everything from adopting a definite quantity by imposing on all actions the qualification stronger relative to gentler, or the reverse, they procure a more and less while doing away with all definite quantity. We are saying now, in effect, that if they do not abolish definite quantity, but let quantity and measurement take a foothold in the domain of the more and less, the strong and mild, they will be driven out of their own territory. For once they take on a definite quantity, there would no longer be hotter and colder. The hotter and equally the colder are always in flux and never remain, while definite quantity means standstill and the end of all progression. The upshot of this argument is that the hotter, together with its opposite, turn out to be unlimited. That seems to be its result, Socrates, although, as you said yourself, it is difficult to follow in these matters. But if they are repeated again and again, perhaps both questioner and respondent may end up in a satisfactory state of agreement. A good idea. Let us carry it out. But consider whether, to avoid the needless length of going through a complete survey of all cases, the following indication may serve to mark out the nature of the unlimited. What indication do you have in mind? Whatever seems to us to become more and less, or susceptible to strong and mild, or to too much and all of that kind, all that we ought to subsume under the genus of the unlimited as its unity. This is in compliance with the principle we agreed on before, that for whatever is dispersed and split up into a multitude, we must try to work out its unifying nature as far as we can, if you remember. I do remember. But look now at what does not admit of these qualifications, but rather their opposites. First of all, the equal and equality, and after the equal, things like double, and all that is related as number to number, or measure to measure. If we subsume all these together under the heading of limit, we would seem to do a fair job. Or what do you say? A very fair job, Socrates. Very well then. But what nature shall we ascribe to the third kind, the one that is the mixture of the two? You will have to answer that question for me, I think. A god rather, if any of them should listen to my prayers. So say your prayer, and wait for the result. I am waiting, and indeed I have the feeling that one of the gods is favourably disposed to us now, Protarchus. What do you mean by that, and what evidence have you? I certainly will tell you. But you follow closely what I say. Just go on. We called something hotter and colder just now, didn't we? Yes. Now add drier and wetter to them, and more and less, faster and slower, taller and shorter, and whatever else we have previously collected together as the one kind that has the nature of taking on the more and less. You mean the nature of the unlimited? Yes. Now take the next step and mix with it the class of the limit. Which one? The very one we have so far omitted to collect together, the class that has the character of limit, although we ought to have given unity to it, just as we collected together the unlimited kind, but perhaps it will come to the same thing even now if, through the collection of these two kinds, the unity of the former kind becomes conspicuous too. What kind do you mean, and how is this supposed to work? The kind that contains equal and double, and whatever else puts an end to the conflicts there are among opposites, making them commensurate and harmonious by imposing a definite number on them. I understand. I have the impression that you are saying that, from such a mixture in each case, certain generations result. Your impression is correct. Then go on with your explanation. Is it not true that in sickness the right combination of the opposites establishes the state of health? Certainly. And does not the same happen in the case of the high and the low, the fast and the slow, which belong to the unlimited? Is it not the presence of these factors in them which forges a limit and thereby creates the different kind of music in their perfection? Beautiful. And once engendered in frost and heat, limit takes away their excesses and unlimitedness, and establishes moderation and harmony in that domain. Quite. And when the unlimited and what has limit are mixed together, we are blessed with seasons and all sorts of fine things of that kind. Who could doubt it? And there are countless other things I have to pass by in silence. With health there come beauty and strength, and again in our soul there is a host of other excellent qualities. It is the goddess herself, fair Philebus, who recognizes how excess and the overabundance of our wickedness allow for no limit in our pleasures and their fulfilment, and she therefore imposes law and order as a limit on them. And while you may complain that this ruins them, I by contrast call it their salvation. How does this strike you, Protarchus? This fits my own intuition, Socrates. These, then, are the three kinds I spoke of, if you see what I mean. I think I've got it. It seems to me that you are referring to the unlimited as one kind, to the limit within things as the other, second kind, but I still do not sufficiently understand what you mean by the third. You are simply overwhelmed by the abundance of the third kind, my admirable friend. Although the class of the unlimited also displays a multiplicity, it preserved at least the appearance of unity, since it was marked out by the common character of the more and less. That is true. About the limit, on the other hand, we do not trouble ourselves, neither that it has plurality, nor whether it is one by nature. Why should we have done so? No reason. But see what I mean by the third kind. I treat all the joint offspring of the other two kinds as a unity, a coming into being, created through the measures imposed by the limit. I understand. But now we have to look at the fourth kind we mentioned earlier, in addition to these three. Let this be our joint investigation. See now whether you think it necessary that everything that comes to be through some cause. Certainly, as far as I can see, how can anything come to be without one? And is it not the case that there is no difference between the nature of what makes and the cause except in name, so that the maker and the cause would rightly be called one? Right. But what about what is made and what comes into being? Will we not find the same situation, that they also do not differ except in name? Exactly. And isn't it the case that what makes is always leading in the order of nature, while the thing made follows since it comes into being through it? Right. Therefore, the cause and what is subservient to the cause in a process of coming to be are also different and not the same. How should they be? It follows then that what comes to be and that from which it is produced represent all three kinds. Very true. We therefore declare that the craftsman who produces all these must be the fourth kind, the cause, since it has been demonstrated sufficiently that it differs from the others. It certainly is different. Now that the four kinds have been distinguished, it seems right to go through them one by one, for memory's sake. Of course. As the first I count the unlimited, limit as the second, afterwards in third place comes the being which is mixed and generated out of those two, and no mistake is made if the cause of this mixture and generation is counted as number 4. How could there be one? Now let's see what is going to be our next point after this, and what concern of ours got us to this point. Was it not this? We were wondering whether second prize should be awarded to pleasure or to knowledge. Wasn't that it? It was indeed. On the basis of our fourfold distinction, we may now perhaps be in a better position to come to a decision about the first and the second prize, the issue that started our whole debate. Perhaps. Let us continue then. We declared the life that combines pleasure and knowledge the winner, didn't we? We did. Should we not take a look at this life and see what it is and to which kind it belongs? Nothing to prevent us. We will, I think, assign it to the third kind, for it is not a mixture of just two elements, but of the sort where all that is unlimited is tied down by limit. It would seem right, then, to make our victorious form of life part of that kind. Very right. That is settled, then. But how about your kind of life, Philebus, which is pleasant and unmixed? To which of the established kind should it by right be assigned? But before you make your pronouncement, answer me the following question. Just tell me, do pleasure and pain have a limit, or are they of the sort that admit the more and less? Certainly the sort that admit the more, Socrates. For how could pleasure be all that is good, if it were not by nature boundless in plenty and increase? Nor would, on the other hand, pain be all that is bad, Philebus. So we have to search for something beside its unlimited character that would bestow on pleasures a share of the good. But take note that pleasure is thereby assigned to the boundless. As to assigning intelligence, knowledge, and reason to one of our aforesaid kinds, how can we avoid the danger of blasphemy, Protarchus and Philebus? A lot seems to hinge on whether or not we give the right answer to this question. Really now, you are extolling your own god, Socrates, just as you extol that goddess of yours, Philebus, but the question needs an answer nevertheless. Socrates is right in this, Philebus, we must obey him. Didn't you choose to speak instead of me? Quite, but now I am at a loss, and I entreat you, Socrates, to act as our spokesman, so that we do not misstate the case of your candidate and thus introduce a false note into the discussion. Your obedient servant, Protarchus, especially since it is not a very difficult task. But did my playful exultation really confuse you, as Philebus claims, when I asked to what kind reason and knowledge belonged? It certainly did, Socrates. It is easy to settle, nevertheless, for all the wise are agreed in true self-exaltation that reason is our king, both over heaven and earth, and perhaps they are justified. But let us go into the discussion of this class itself at greater length, if you have no objections. Discuss it in whichever way you like, Socrates, and don't be apologetic about long-windedness. We will not lose patience. Well said. Let us proceed by taking up this question. What question? Whether we hold the view that the universe and this whole world order are ruled by unreason and irregularity, as chance would have it, or whether they are not rather, as our forebears taught us, governed by reason and by the order of a wonderful intelligence. How can you even think of a comparison here, Socrates? What you suggest now is downright impious, I would say. The only account that can do justice to the wonderful spectacle presented by the cosmic order of sun, moon, and stars, and the revolution of the whole heaven, is that reason arranges it all, and I for my part would never waver in saying or believing it. Is this what you want us to do, that we should not only conform to the view of earlier thinkers who professed this as the truth, repeating without any risk what others have said, but that we should share their risk and blame if some formidable opponent denies it and argues that disorder rules? How could I fail to want it? Well then, now face up to the consequences of this position that we have to come to terms with. Please tell me. We somehow discern that what makes up the nature of the bodies of all animals, fire, water, and air, and earth, as storm-battered sailors say, are part of their composition. Very much so. We are indeed battered by difficulties in our discussion. Come now, and realize that the following applies to all constituents that belong to us. What is it? That the amount of each of these elements in us is small and insignificant, that it does not possess in the very least the purity or the power that is worthy of its nature. Take one example as an illustration representative for all. There is something called fire that belongs to us, and then again there is fire in the universe. No doubt. And is not the fire that belongs to us small in amount, feeble and poor, while the fire in the universe overwhelms us by its size and beauty, and by the display of all its power? What you say is very true. But what about this? Is the fire in the universe generated, nourished, and ruled by the fire that belongs to us, or is it not quite the reverse, that your heat and mine, and that in every animal, owe all this to the cosmic fire? It is not even worth answering that question. Right, and I guess you will give the same answer about the earth here in the animals when it is compared to the earth in the universe, and likewise about the other elements I mentioned a little earlier. Is that your answer? Who could answer differently without seeming insane? No one at all. But now see what follows. To the combination of all these elements taken as a unit, we give the name body, don't we? Certainly. Now realize that the same holds in the case of what we call the ordered universe. It will turn out to be a body in the same sense, since it is composed of the same elements. What you say is undeniable. Does the body of the universe as a whole provide for the sustenance of what is body in our sphere, or is it the reverse, and the universe possesses and derives all the goods enumerated from ours? That too is a question not worth asking, Socrates. But what about the following? Is this also a question not worth asking? Tell me what the question is. Of the body that belongs to us, will we not say that it has a soul? Quite obviously that is what we will say. But where does it come from, unless the body of the universe, which has the same properties as ours, but more beautiful in all respects, happens to possess a soul? Clearly from nowhere else. We surely cannot maintain this assumption with respect to our four classes, limit the unlimited, their mixture, and their cause which is present in everything, that this cause is recognized as all-encompassing wisdom, since among us it imports the soul and provides training for the body and medicine for its ailments, and in other cases order and restitution, but that it should fail to be responsible for the same things on a large scale in the whole universe, things that are in addition beautiful and pure, for the contrivance of what has so fair and wonderful a nature. That would make no sense at all. But if that is inconceivable, we had better pursue the alternative account and affirm, as we have said often, that there is plenty of the unlimited in the universe as well as sufficient limit, and that there is, above them, a certain cause of no small significance that orders and coordinates the years, seasons, and months, and which has every right to the title of wisdom and reason. The greatest right. But there could be no wisdom and reason without a soul. Certainly not. You will therefore say that in the nature of Zeus there is the soul of a king, as well as a king's reason, in virtue of this power displayed by the cause, while paying tribute for other fine qualities in the other divinities, in conformity with the names by which they like to be addressed. Very much so. Do not think that we have engaged in an idle discussion here, Protarchus, for it comes as a support for the thinkers of old who held the view that reason is forever the ruler over the universe. It certainly does. It also has provided an answer to my query, that reason belongs to that kind which is the cause of everything. But that was one of our 4 kinds, so there you already have the solution to our problem in your hands. I have indeed, and quite to my satisfaction, although at first I did not realize that you were answering. Sometimes joking is a relief from seriousness. Well said. By now, dear friend, we have arrived at a satisfactory explanation of the class that reason belongs to and what power it has. Quite so. And as to pleasure, it became apparent quite a while ago what class it belongs to. Definitely. Let us firmly keep it in mind about both of them, that reason is akin to cause and is part of that family, while pleasure itself is unlimited and belongs to the kind that in and by itself neither possesses nor will ever possess a beginning, middle, or end. We will keep it in mind. How could we help it? After this we must next find out in what kind of thing each of them resides, and what kind of condition makes them come to be when they do. Let us take pleasure first, for just as we searched for the class it belongs to first, so we start our present investigation with it. But again, we will not be able to provide a satisfactory examination of pleasure if we do not study it together with pain. If that is the direction we have to take, then let's go that way. Do you share my view about their generation? What view? Pleasure and pain seem to me by nature to arise together in the common kind. Could you remind us once again, Socrates, which of those you mentioned you called the common kind? As far as I can see, my most esteemed friend, that is noble of you. By the common kind we meant the one that was number 3 on our list of 4. You mean the one you introduced after the unlimited and the limited, the one that included health and also harmony, I believe. Excellently stated. But now try to put your mind to this as much as possible. Just go on. What I claim is that when we find the harmony in living creatures disrupted, there will at the same time be a disintegration of their nature and a rise of pain. What you say is very plausible. But if the reverse happens, and harmony is regained and the former nature restored, we have to say that pleasure arises, if we must pronounce only a few words on the weightiest matters in the shortest possible time. I believe that you are right, Socrates, but why don't we try to be more explicit about this very point? Well, is it not child's play to understand the most ordinary and well-known cases? What cases do you mean? Hunger, I take it, is a case of disintegration and pain? Yes. And eating the corresponding refilling is a pleasure? Yes. But thirst is, once again, a destruction and pain, while the process that fills what is dried out with liquid is pleasure. And further, unnatural separation and dissolution, the affection caused by heat is pain, while the natural restoration of cooling down is pleasure. Very much so. And the unnatural coagulation of the fluids in an animal through freezing is pain, while the natural process of their dissolution or redistribution is pleasure. To cut matters short, see whether the following account seems acceptable to you. When the natural combination of limit and unlimitedness that forms a live organism, as I explained before, is destroyed, this destruction is pain, while the return towards its own nature, this general restoration, is pleasure. So be it, for it seems to provide at least an outline. Shall we then accept this as one kind of pleasure and pain, what happens in either of these 2 kinds of processes? Accepted. But now accept also the anticipation by the soul itself of these 2 kinds of experiences. The hope before the actual pleasure will be pleasant and comforting, while the expectation of pain will be frightening and painful. This turns out, then, to be a different kind of pleasure and pain, namely the expectation that the soul experiences by itself without the body. Your assumption is correct. In both these cases, as I see it at least, pleasure and pain will arise pure and unmixed with each other, so that it will become apparent as far as pleasure is concerned, whether its whole class is to be welcomed, or whether this should rather be the privilege of one of the other classes which we have already discussed. Pleasure and pain may rather turn out to share the predicament of hot and cold and other such things that are welcome at one point, but unwelcome at another, because they are not good. But it happens that some of them do occasionally assume a beneficial nature. You are quite right if you suggest that this must be the direction to take if we want to find a solution to what we are looking for now. First, then, let us take a look together at the following point. If it truly holds, as we said, that their disintegration constitutes pain, but restoration is pleasure, what kind of state should we ascribe to animals when they are neither destroyed nor restored? What kind of condition is this? Think about it carefully and tell me, is there not every necessity that the animal will at the time experience neither pain nor pleasure, neither large nor small? That is indeed necessary. There is then such a condition, a third one, besides the one in which one is pleased or in which one is in pain? Obviously. Make an effort to keep this fact in mind, for it makes quite a difference for our judgment of pleasure whether we remember that there is such a state or not. But we had better give it a little more consideration if you don't mind. Just tell me how. You realize that nothing prevents the person who has chosen the life of reason from living in this state. You mean without pleasure and pain? It was one of the conditions agreed on in our comparison of lives that the person who chooses the life of reason and intelligence must not enjoy pleasures either large or small. That was indeed agreed on. He may then live in this fashion, and perhaps there would be nothing absurd if this life turns out to be the most godlike. It is at any rate not likely that the gods experience either pleasure or the opposite. It is certainly not likely, for either of these states would be quite unseemly in their case, but this is a question we had better take up again later, if it should be relevant to our discussion. But let us count it as an additional point in favour of reason in the competition for second prize, even if we cannot count it in that for first prize. A very good suggestion. But now, as for the other kind of pleasure, of which we said that it belongs to the soul itself, it depends entirely on memory. In what way? It seems we have first to determine what kind of thing memory is. In fact, I am afraid that we will have to determine the nature of perception, even before that of memory, if the whole subject matter is to become at all clear to us in the right way. How do you mean? You must realize that some of the various affections of the body are extinguished within the body before they reach the soul, leaving it unaffected. Others penetrate through both body and soul and provoke a kind of upheaval that is peculiar to each, but also common to both of them. I realize that. Are we fully justified if we claim that the soul remains oblivious of those affections that do not penetrate both, while it is not oblivious of those that penetrate both? Of course we are justified. But you must not so misunderstand me as to suppose I meant that this obliviousness gave rise to any kind of forgetting. Forgetting is rather the loss of memory, but in the case in question here, no memory has yet arisen. It would be absurd to say that there could be the process of losing something that neither is nor was in existence, wouldn't it? Quite definitely. You only have to make some changes in names then. How so? Instead of saying that the soul is oblivious when it remains unaffected by the disturbances of the body, now change the name of what you so far called obliviousness to that of non-perception. I understand. But when the soul and body are jointly affected and moved by one and the same affection, if you call this motion perception, you would say nothing out of the way. You are right. And so we know by now what we mean by perception. Certainly. So if someone were to call memory the preservation of perception, he would be speaking correctly, as far as I am concerned. Rightly so. And do we not hold that recollection differs from memory? Perhaps. Does not their difference lie in this? In what? Do we not call it recollection when the soul recalls as much as possible by itself, without the aid of the body, what she had once experienced together with the body? Or how would you put it? I quite agree. But on the other hand, when, after the loss of memory of either a perception or again a piece of knowledge, the soul calls up this memory for itself, we also call all these events recollection? You are right. The point for the sake of which all this has been said is the following. What is it? That we grasp as fully and clearly as possible the pleasure that the soul experiences without the body, as well as the desire, and through a clarification of these states, the nature of both pleasure and desire will somehow be revealed. Let us now discuss this as our next issue, Socrates. It seems that in our investigation we have to discuss many points about the origin of pleasure and about all its different varieties, for it looks as if we will first have to determine what desire is and on what occasion it arises. Let us determine that then. We have nothing to lose. We will certainly lose something, Protarchus, by discovering what we are looking for now. We will lose our ignorance about it. You rightly remind us of that fact. But now let us try to return to the further pursuit of our subject. Are we agreed now that hunger and thirst and many other things of this sort are desires? Quite in agreement. But what is the common feature whose recognition allows us to address all these phenomena which differ so much by the same name? Heavens, that is perhaps not an easy thing to determine, Socrates, but it must be done nevertheless. Shall we go back to the same point of departure? What point? When we say he is thirsty, we always have something in mind. We do, meaning that he is getting empty. Certainly. But thirst is a desire. Yes, the desire for drink. For drink or for the filling with drink? For the filling with drink, I think. Whoever among us is emptied, it seems, desires the opposite of what he suffers. Being emptied, he desires to be filled. That is perfectly obvious. But what about this problem? If someone is emptied for the first time, is there any way he could be in touch with filling, either through sensation or memory, since he has no experience of it, either in the present or ever in the past? How should he? But we do maintain that he who has a desire desires something. Naturally. He does, then, not have a desire for what he in fact experiences, for he is thirsty, and this is a process of emptying. His desire is rather of filling. Yes. Something in the person who is thirsty must necessarily somehow be in contact with filling. Necessarily. But it is impossible that this should be the body, for the body is what is emptied out. Yes. The only option we are left with is that the soul makes contact with the filling, and it clearly must do so through memory. Or could it make contact through anything else? Clearly through nothing else. Do we understand, then, what conclusions we have to draw from what has been said? What are they? Our argument forces us to conclude that desire is not a matter of the body. Why is that? Because it shows that every living creature always strives towards the opposite of its own experience. And very much so. This impulse, then, that drives it towards the opposite of its own state, signifies that it has memory of that opposite state. Certainly. By pointing out that it is this memory that directs it towards the objects of its desires, our argument has established that every impulse and desire, and the rule over the whole animal, is the domain of the soul. Very much so. Our argument will, then, never allow that it is our body that experiences thirst, hunger, or anything of that sort. Absolutely not. There is yet a further point we have to consider that is connected with the same conditions, for our discussion seems to me to indicate that there is a form of life that consists of these conditions. What does it consist of, and what form of life are you talking about? It consists of filling and emptying, and all such processes as are related to both the preservation and the destruction of animals. And when one of us is in either of the two conditions, he is in pain, or again, he experiences pleasure, depending on the nature of these changes. That is indeed what happens. But what if someone finds himself in between these two affections? What do you mean by in between? When he is pained by his condition and remembers the pleasant things that would put an end to the pain, but is not yet being filled, what about this situation? Should we claim that he is then in between these two affections or not? We should claim that. And should we say that the person is altogether in pain or pleasure? By heaven, he seems to me to be suffering a twofold pain. One consists in the body's condition, the other in the soul's desire caused by the expectation. How do you mean that there is a twofold pain, Protarchus? Does it not sometimes happen that one of us is emptied at one particular time, but is in clear hope of being filled, while at another time he is, on the contrary, without hope? It certainly happens. And don't you think that he enjoys this hope for replenishment when he remembers, while he is simultaneously in pain because he has been emptied at that time? Necessarily. This is, then, the occasion when a human being and other animals are simultaneously undergoing pain and pleasure. It seems so. But what if he is without hope of attaining any replenishment when he is emptied? Is not that the situation where this twofold pain occurs, which you have just come across and simply taken to be twofold? That is quite undeniable, Socrates. Now let us apply the results of our investigation of these affections to this purpose. What is it? Shall we say that these pains and pleasures are true or false, or rather that some of them are true, but not others? But how could there be false pleasures or pains, Socrates? Well, how could there be true or false fears, true or false expectations, true or false judgments, Protarchus? For judgments I certainly would be ready to admit it, but not for the other cases. What is it you are saying? I am afraid we are stirring up a weighty controversy here. You are right. But if it is relevant to what we were discussing before, you, worthy son of that man, it ought to be taken up. Perhaps, in that case, we have to forego any excursions here or any discussion of whatever side issues are not directly relevant to our topic. Right. But tell me this, for I have lived in continued perplexity about the difficulty we have come across now. What is your view? Are there not false pleasures as well as true ones? How should there be? Do you really want to claim that there is no one who, either in a dream or awake, either in madness or any other delusion, sometimes believes he is enjoying himself, while in reality he is not doing so, or believes he is in pain while he is not? We all assume that this is indeed the case, Socrates. But rightly so? Should we not rather take up the question whether or not this claim is justified? We should take it up, as I at least would say. Let us try to achieve more clarity about what we said concerning pleasure and judgment. Is there something we call judging? Yes. And is there also taking pleasure? Yes. But there is also what the judgment is about. Certainly. And also what the pleasure is about. Very much so. But what makes a judgment, whether it judges rightly or not, cannot be deprived of really making a judgment. How should it? And what takes pleasure, whether it is rightly pleased or not, can obviously never be deprived of really taking pleasure. Yes, that is also the case. But what we have to question is how it is that judgment is usually either true or false, while pleasure admits only truth, even though in both cases there is equally real judgment and real pleasure. We have to question that. Is it that judgment takes on the additional qualification of true and false, and is thus not simply judgment, but also has either one of these two qualities? Would you say that is a point we have to look into? Yes. And furthermore, whether quite generally certain things allow extra qualifications, while pleasure and pain are simply what they are, and do not take on any qualifications, about that we also have to come to an agreement. Obviously, for at least it is not difficult to see that they too take on qualifications, for we said earlier that both of them, pleasures as well as pains, can be great and small and also have intensity. We certainly did. But if some bad state should attach itself to any of them, then we would say that the judgment becomes a bad one, and the pleasure becomes bad too, Protarchus. Naturally, Socrates. But what if some rightness or the opposite of rightness are added to something? Would we not call the judgment right if it were right, and the pleasure too? Necessarily. And if a mistake is made about the object of judgment, then we say that the judgment that makes that mistake is not right and does not judge rightly. How could it? But what if we notice that a pain or pleasure is mistaken in what is pleased or pained about? Shall we then call it right or proper, or give it other names of praise? That would be impossible, if indeed pleasure should be mistaken. As to pleasure, it certainly often seems to arise in us not with a right, but with a false judgment. Of course, but what we call false in this case at that point is the judgment, Socrates. Nobody would dream of calling the pleasure itself false. You certainly put up a spirited defence for pleasure now, Protarchus. Not at all. I only repeat what I hear. Is there no difference between the pleasure that goes with right judgment and knowledge, and the kind that often comes to any of us with false judgment and ignorance? There's probably no small difference. So let us turn to inspect the difference between them. Lead on where you like. I lead you this way. What way? Of our judgment we say that it is sometimes false and sometimes true. It is. And as we said just now, these are often accompanied by pleasure and pain. I'm talking of true and false judgment. That's right. And is it not memory and perception that lead to judgment, or the attempt to come to a definite judgment, as the case may be? Indeed. Do we agree that the following must happen here? What? Wouldn't you say that it often happens that someone who cannot get a clear view because he is looking from a distance wants to make up his mind about what he sees? I would say so. And might he then not again raise another question for himself? What question? What could that be that appears to stand near that rock under a tree? Do you find it plausible that someone might say these words to himself when he sets his eyes on such appearances? Certainly. And might he not afterwards, as an answer to his own question, say to himself, "It is a man," and in so speaking would get it right? No doubt. But he might also be mistaken and say that what he sees is a statue, the work of some herdsman. Very likely. But if he were in company, he might actually say out loud to his companion what he had told himself, and so what we earlier called judgment would turn into an assertion. To be sure. Whereas if he is alone, he entertains this thought by himself, and sometimes he may even resume his way for quite a long time with the thought in his mind. No doubt. But look, do you share my view on this? What view? That our soul in such a situation is comparable to a book. How so? If memory and perceptions concur with other impressions at a particular occasion, then they seem to me to inscribe words in our soul, as it were. And if what is written is true, then we form a true judgment and a true account of the matter. But if what our scribe writes is false, then the result will be the opposite of the truth. I quite agree, and I accept this way of putting it. Do you also accept that there is another craftsman at work in our soul at the same time? What kind of craftsman? A painter who follows the scribe and provides illustrations to his words in the soul. How and when do we say he does this work? When a person takes his judgments and assertions directly from sight or any other sense perception, and then views the images he has formed inside himself, corresponding to those judgments and assertions, or is not something of this sort that is going on in us? Quite definitely. And are not the pictures of true judgments and assertions true, and the pictures of the false ones false? Certainly. If we have been right with what we have said so far, let us, in addition, come to terms about this question. What about? Whether these experiences are necessarily confined to the past and the present, but are not extended into the future. They should apply equally to all the tenses, past, present, and future. Now, did we not say before about the pleasures and pains that belong to the soul alone, that they might precede those that go through the body? It would therefore be possible that we have anticipatory pleasures and pains about the future. Undeniably. And are those writings and pictures which come to be in us, as we said earlier, concerned only with the past and the present, but not with the future? Decidedly with the future. If you say decidedly, it is because all of them are really hopes for future times, and we are forever brimful of hopes throughout our lifetime. Quite definitely. Well then, in addition to what has been said now, also answer this question. Concerning what? Is not a man who is just, pious, and good in all respects also loved by the gods? How could he fail to be? But what about someone who is unjust and in all respects evil? Isn't he that man's opposite? Of course. And is not everyone, as we just said, always full of many hopes? Certainly. There are then assertions in each of us that we call hopes. Yes. But there are also those painted images, and someone often envisages himself in the possession of an enormous amount of gold and of a lot of pleasures as a consequence, and in addition he also sees in this inner picture of himself that he is beside himself with delight. What else? Now, do we want to say that in the case of good people these pictures are usually true because they are dear to the gods, while quite the opposite usually holds in the case of wicked ones? Or is this not what we ought to say? That is just what we ought to say. And wicked people nevertheless have pleasures painted in their minds, even though they are somehow false. Right. So wicked people as a rule enjoy false pleasures, but the good among mankind true ones. Quite necessarily so. From what has now been said, it follows that there are false pleasures in human souls that are quite ridiculous imitations of true ones, and also such pains. There certainly are. Now, it was agreed that whoever judges anything at all is always really judging, even if it is not about anything existing in the present, past, or future. Right. And these were, I think, the conditions that produce a false judgment and judging falsely, weren't they? Yes. But should we not also grant to pleasures and pains a condition that is analogous in these ways? In what ways? In the sense that whoever has any pleasure at all, however ill-founded it may be, really does have pleasure, even if sometimes it is not about anything that either is the case, or ever was the case, or often, or perhaps most of the time, refers to anything that ever will be the case. That also must necessarily be so. And the same account holds in the case of fear, anger, and everything of that sort, namely that all of them can at times be false. Certainly. Well then, do we have any other way of distinguishing between bad and good judgments than their falsity? We have no other. Nor, I presume, will we find any other way to account for badness in the case of pleasures, unless they are false. What you say is quite the opposite of the truth, Socrates. It is not at all because they are false that we regard pleasures or pains as bad, but because there is some other grave and wide-ranging kind of badness involved. But let us discuss bad pleasures and what badness there is in their case a little later, if we still feel like it. Now we have to take up false pleasures in another sense and show that there is a great variety that arise and are at work in us. This argument will perhaps come in handy later, when we have to make our decisions. That may well be so, at least if there are any such pleasures. There certainly are, Protarchus. I at least am convinced. But until this is our accepted opinion, we cannot leave this conviction unexamined. Right. So let us get ready like athletes to form a line of attack around this problem. Here we go. We did say a short while ago in our discussion, as we may recall, that when what we call desires are in us, then body and soul part company and have each their separate experiences. We do remember that was said before. And wasn't it the soul that had desires, desires for conditions opposite to the actual ones of the body, while it was the body that undergoes the pain or the pleasure of some affection? That was indeed so. Draw your conclusions as to what is going on here. You tell me. What happens is this. Under these circumstances, pains and pleasures exist side by side, and there are simultaneously opposite perceptions of them, as we have just made clear. Yes, that is clear. But did we not also discuss this point and come to an agreement how to settle it earlier? What point? That the two of them, both pleasure and pain, admit the more and less and belong to the unlimited kind. That was what we said. What about it? Do we have any means of making a right decision about these matters? Where and in what respect? In the case where we intend to come to a decision about any of them in such circumstances, which one is greater or smaller, or which one is more intensive or stronger, pain compared to pleasure, or pain compared to pain, or pleasure to pleasure? Yes, these questions do arise, and that is what we want to decide. Well then, does it happen only to eyesight that seeing objects from afar or close by distorts the truth and causes false judgments? Or does not the same thing happen also in the case of pleasure and pain? Much more so, Socrates. But this is the reverse of the result we reached a little earlier. What are you referring to? Earlier, it was true and false judgments which affected the respective pleasures and pains with their own condition. Quite right. But now it applies to pleasures and pains themselves. It is because they are alternately looked at from close up or far away, or simultaneously put side by side, that the pleasures seem greater compared to pain and more intensive, and pains seem, on the contrary, moderate in comparison with pleasures. It is quite inevitable that such conditions arise under these circumstances. But if you take that portion of them by which they appear greater or smaller than they really are, and cut it off from each of them as a mere appearance and without real being, you will neither admit that this appearance is right, nor dare to say that anything connected with this portion of pleasure or pain is right and true. Certainly not. Next in order after these we will find pleasures and pains in animals that are even falser than these, both in appearance and reality, if we approach them in this way. What are they, and what is the way? It has now been said repeatedly that it is a destruction of the nature of those entities through combinations and separations, through processes of filling and emptying, as well as certain kinds of growth and decay, that gives rise to pain and suffering, distress, and whatever else comes to pass that goes under such a name. Yes, that has often been said. But when things are restored to their own nature again, this restoration, as we established in our agreement among ourselves, is pleasure. Correct. But what if nothing of that sort happens to our body? What then? When could that ever happen, Socrates? Your objection is not to the point, Protarchus. How so? Because you do not prevent me from putting my question to you again. What question? If, in fact, nothing of that sort took place, I will ask you what would necessarily be the consequence of this for us. You mean if the body is not moved in either direction, Socrates? That is my question. This much is clear, Socrates, that in such a case there would not be either any pleasure or pain at all. Very well put. But I guess what you meant to say is that we necessarily are always experiencing one or the other, as the wise men say, for everything is in an eternal flux, upward and downward. They do say that, and what they say seems important. How else, since they themselves are important people? But I do want to avoid this argument which now assails us. I plan to escape it in this way, and you'd better make your escape with me. Just tell me how. So be it. We will reply to them. But as for you, answer me this question, whether all living creatures in all cases notice it whenever they are affected in some way, so that we notice when we grow or experience anything of that sort, or whether it is quite otherwise. It is indeed quite otherwise. Almost all of these processes totally escape our notice. But then what we just agreed to was not well spoken, that the changes, upwards and downwards, evoke pleasures and pains. How could it? But if it is stated in this way, it will be better and become unobjectionable. In what way? That great changes cause pleasures and pains in us, while moderate or small ones engender neither of the two effects. That is more correct than the other statement, Socrates. But if this is correct, then we are back with the same kind of life we discussed before. What kind? The life that we said was painless, but also devoid of charm. Undeniably. So we end up with three kinds of life: the life of pleasure, the life of pain, and the neutral life. Or what would you say about these matters? I would put it in the same way, that there are three kinds of life. But to be free of pain would not be the same thing as to have pleasure. How could it be the same? If you hear someone say that it is the most pleasant thing of all to live one's whole life without pain, how do you understand the speaker's intention? To my understanding, he seems to identify pleasure with freedom from pain. Now, imagine three sorts of things, whichever you may like, and because these are high-sounding names, let us call them gold, silver, and what is neither of the two. Consider it done. Is there any way conceivable in which this third kind could turn out to be the same as one of our other two sorts, gold or silver? How could it? That the middle kind of life could turn out to be either pleasant or painful would be the wrong thing to think, if anyone happened to think so, and it would be the wrong thing to say, if anyone should say so, according to the proper account of the matter. No doubt. But we do find people who both think so and say so, my friend. Certainly. And do they really believe they experience pleasure when they are not in pain? They say so at any rate. They believe, therefore, that they are pleased at that time, otherwise they would not say that they are. It looks that way. But they hold a false judgment about pleasure, if in fact freedom from pain and pleasure each have a nature of their own. But they do have their own. What decisions shall we make? That there are three states in us, as we said just now, or that there are only two, pain being an evil in human life, and liberation from pain, also called pleasure, being the good as such? But why is it that we are asking ourselves this question now, Socrates? I don't get the point. That is because you don't really understand who the enemies of our Philebus here are. What enemies do you mean? I mean people with a tremendous reputation in natural science who say that there are no such things as pleasures at all. How so? They hold that everything the followers of Philebus call pleasures are nothing but escape from pain. Do you suggest we should believe them, Socrates? Or what is it you want us to do? Not that, but to use them as seers who make their prophecies not in virtue of any art, but in virtue of a certain harshness in their nature. It is a nature not without nobility, but out of an inordinate hatred that they have conceived against the power of pleasure, they refuse to acknowledge anything healthy in it, even to the point that they regard its very attractiveness itself as witchcraft rather than pleasure. You may now make use of them for our purposes, taking notice of the rest of their complaints that result from their harshness. After that you will hear what I, for my part, regard as true pleasures, so that through an examination of these two opposed points of view we can reach a decision about the power of pleasure. A fair proposal. Let us attach ourselves to them as allies and follow their traces in the direction in which their dour argument points us. I think they employ reasoning of this kind, starting from some such basic principle. If we wanted to know the nature of any character, like that of hardness, would we get a better understanding if we looked at the hardest kinds of things rather than at what has a low degree of hardness? Now, it is your task, Protarchus, to answer these difficult people just as you answered me. Gladly, and my answer to them will be that I would look at hardness of the first degree. But again, if we wanted to study the form of pleasure to see what kind of nature it has, in that case we ought not to look at low-level pleasures, but at those that are said to be the strongest and most intensive. Everyone would grant you this point. Now, aren't the most immediate and greatest among the pleasures the ones connected with the body, as we have often said? No doubt. And is it the case that pleasures are more intensive or set in with greater intensity when people suffer from an illness than when they are healthy? We have to beware of a hasty answer here, lest we get tripped up. Perhaps we might be inclined to affirm this rather for the healthy people. Quite likely. But what about this? Are not those pleasures overwhelming which are also preceded by the greatest desires? That is certainly true. And when people suffer from fever or any such disease, aren't they more subject to thirst, chill, and whatever else continues to affect them through the body? Do they not feel greater deprivations and also greater pleasures at their replenishment? Or shall we deny that this is true? It seems undeniable as you explained it now. Very well. Are we justified then if we claim that whoever wants to study the greatest pleasures should turn to sickness, not health? Now, mind you, my question was not whether the very sick have more pleasures than healthy people. My concern is rather with the size and intensity of the condition when it takes place. Our task, as we said, is to comprehend both what its true nature is and how those conceive of it who deny that there is any such thing as pleasure at all. I am following quite well what you say. You might as well be its guide, Protarchus. Now tell me, do you recognize greater pleasures in a life given to excesses? I do not say more pleasures, but pleasures that exceed by their force and intensity than in a moderate life? Think carefully about it before you answer. I quite understand what you are after. I see indeed a huge difference. The moderate people somehow always stand under the guidance of the proverbial maxim, nothing too much, and obey it. But as to foolish people and those given to debauchery, the excesses of their pleasures drive them near madness and to shrieks of frenzy. Good. But if this is how it stands, then it is obvious that it is in some vicious state of soul and body, and not in virtue, that the greatest pleasures, as well as the greatest pains, have their origin. Obviously. So we must pick out some of them to find out what characteristic of theirs made us call them the greatest. Necessarily. Now, look at the pleasures that go with these types of maladies, what kinds of conditions they are. What types do you mean? Those pleasures of a rather repugnant type, which our harsh friends hate above all. What kinds? For example, the relief from itching by rubbing, and all of that sort that needs no other remedy. But if this condition should befall us, what in heaven's name should we call it? Pleasure or pain? That really would seem to be a mixed experience, with a bad component, Socrates. I did not raise this question with the intention of alluding to Philebus, but without a clarification of these pleasures and of those who cultivate them, we could hardly come to any resolution of our problem. Then let us take up the whole tribe of these pleasures. You mean the ones that have that mixed nature? Right. There are mixtures that have their origin in the body and are confined to the body. Then there are mixtures found in the soul, and they are confined to the soul. But then we will also find mixtures of pleasures and pains in both soul and body, and at one time the combination of both will be called pleasure, at other times it will be called pain. How so? When someone undergoes restoration or destruction, he experiences two opposed conditions at once. He may feel hot while shivering or feel chilled while sweating. I suppose he will then want to retain one of these conditions and get rid of the other. But if this so-called bittersweet condition is hard to shake, it first causes irritation and later on turns into wild excitement. A very accurate description. Now, isn't it the case that some of those mixtures contain an even amount of pleasures and pain, while there is a preponderance of either of the two in others? Right. Take the case we just mentioned of itching and scratching as an example where the pains outweigh the pleasures. Now, when the irritation and infection are inside and cannot be reached by rubbing and scratching, there is only a relief on the surface. In case they treat these parts by exposing them to fire or its opposite, they go from one extreme to the other in their distress. They sometimes procure enormous pleasures, but sometimes this leads to a state inside that is opposite to that outside, with a mixture of pains and pleasures, whichever way the balance may turn, because this treatment disperses by force what was mixed together, or mixes together what was separate, so that pains arise besides the pleasures, necessarily. Now, in all those cases where the mixture contains a surplus of pleasure, the small admixture of pain gives rise only to a tickle and a mild irritation, while the predominant part of pleasure causes contractions of the body to the point of leaping and kicking, colour changes of all sorts, distortion of features, and wild palpitations. It finally drives the person totally out of his mind, so that he shouts aloud like a madman. Very much so. And this state causes him and others to say of him that he is almost dying of these pleasures, and the more profligate and mindless he is, the more will he pursue them by any means possible, and he calls them supreme and considers as the happiest of all mortals whoever lives in continuous enjoyment of them as much as that is possible. Your description fits exactly the preconception of the common run of people, Socrates. Yes, as far as concerns the pleasures that arise when there is a mixture of the external and internal state of the body, Protarchus. But take now the cases where the soul's contributions are opposed to the body's. When there is pain over and against pleasures, or pleasure against pain, both are finally joined in a mixed state. We have talked about them earlier and agreed that in these cases it is the deprivation that gives rise to the desire for replenishment, and while the expectation is pleasant, the deprivation itself is painful. When we discussed this, we did not make any special mention, as we do now, of the fact that, in the vast number of cases where soul and body are not in agreement, the final result is a single mixture that combines pleasure and pain. I suspect that you are right. But here we are still left with one further kind of mixture of pleasure and pain. Tell me what it is. The case, a common one, where the mixture is the product of affections within the soul itself, as we said before. What was it again that we said? Take wrath, fear, longing, lamentations, love, jealousy, malice, and other things like that. Don't you regard them as a kind of pain within the soul itself? I certainly do. And don't we find that they are full of marvellous pleasures? Or do we need the famous lines as a reminder about wrath, that can embitter even the wise, but much sweeter than soft-flowing honey? Similarly, in the case of lamentations and longing, aren't there also pleasures mixed in with the pain? No need for further reminders. In all these cases it must be just as you said. And the same happens in those who watch tragedies. There is laughter mixed with the weeping, if you remember. How could I forget? Now, look at our state of mind in comedy. Don't you realize that it also involves a mixture of pleasure and pain? I don't quite see that yet. It is indeed not quite so easy to see that this condition applies under those circumstances. It certainly is not to me. Since it is such an obscure matter, let us be the more careful, for this will help us to recognize more easily when there is a mixture of pain and pleasure in other cases as well. Please tell me. Since we mentioned the word malice, do you treat malice as a pain of the soul or what? I do. On the other hand, will not the malicious person display pleasure at his neighbour's misfortunes? Very much so. Now, ignorance is a vice, and so is what we call stupidity. Decidedly. What conclusions do you draw from this about the nature of the ridiculous? You tell me. It is, in sum, a kind of vice that derives its name from a special disposition. It is, among all the vices, the one with a character that stands in direct opposition to the one recommended by the famous inscription in Delphi. You mean the one that says, "Know thyself, Socrates"? I do. The opposite recommendation would obviously be that we not know ourselves at all. No doubt. Go on and make a subdivision of this disposition into three, Protarchus. What do you mean? I'm afraid I don't know how to. Are you saying that it is up to me to make this division now? This is indeed what I'm saying, but in addition I beg you to do so. Are there not necessarily three ways in which it is possible not to know oneself? What are they? The first way concerns money, if someone thinks himself richer than he in fact is. Many people certainly share that condition. Even more consider themselves taller and handsomer than they in fact are, and believe they have other such physical advantages. Definitely. But an overwhelming number are mistaken about the third kind, which belongs to the soul, namely virtue, and believe that they are superior in virtue, although they are not. Very much so. And again, among the virtues, is it not especially to wisdom that the largest number of people lay claim, puffing themselves up with quarrels and false pretensions to would-be knowledge? Undeniably so. It would therefore be quite justified to say that all these conditions are bad. Quite justified. So we must continue with our division of ignorance, Protarchus, if we want to find out what a strange mixture of pleasure and pain this comic malice is. How would you suggest that we should further subdivide? In the case of all those who have such a false opinion about themselves, is it not most necessary, as it is for all mankind, that it be combined either with strength and power, or with its opposite? Necessarily. So make this the point of division. All those who combine this delusion with weakness, and are unable to avenge themselves when they are laughed at, you are justified in calling ridiculous. But as for those who do have the power and strength to take revenge, if you call them dangerous and hateful, you are getting exactly the right conception about them. For ignorance on the side of the strong and powerful is odious and ugly. It is harmful even for their neighbours, both the ignorance itself and its imitations, whatever they may be. Ignorance on the side of the weak, by contrast, deserves to be placed among the ridiculous in rank and nature. You are right about this division, but I am still not quite clear about where there is a mixture of pleasure and pain in these cases. So take first the nature of malice. Please explain. It contains a kind of unjust pain and pleasure. Necessarily. Now, if you rejoice about evils that happen to your enemy, is there any injustice or malice in your pleasure? How should there be? But is there any occasion when it is not unjust to be pleased rather than pain to see bad things happen to your friends? Clearly not. But we just agreed that ignorance is bad for everyone. Right. Let us take now the ignorance of friends, which we said came in three versions, would-be wisdom and would-be beauty, and the other sort we just mentioned, each of which is ridiculous if weak, but odious if strong. Now, are we ready to affirm of our friend's state what we just said, namely, that it is ridiculous if it is harmless to others? Very much so. But did we not agree that it is bad if it is ignorance? We certainly did. But if we laugh about it, are we pleased or pained by it? We are pleased, obviously. But this pleasure in the face of the misfortunes of friends, did we not say that it was the product of malice? Necessarily. Our argument leads to the conclusion that if we laugh at what is ridiculous about our friends by mixing pleasure with malice, we thereby mix pleasure with pain. For we had agreed earlier that malice is a pain in the soul, that laughing is a pleasure, and that both occur together on those occasions. True. The upshot of our discussion, then, is that in lamentations as well as in tragedies and comedies, not only on stage but also in all of life's tragedies and comedies, pleasures are mixed with pains, and so it is on infinitely other occasions. It would be impossible not to agree with this, even for the most ambitious defence of the opposite position, Socrates. Now, we had on our list of examples wrath, longing, lamentation, fear, love, jealousy, malice, and whatever else, and we said that in these cases we would discern the mixture that we have already mentioned so frequently, right? Right. So we understand then that our whole explanation also applies to longing, malice, and wrath. How could we fail to understand that? And there are many other such cases to which it applies. A great many. Now, what precisely do you think was the purpose for which I pointed out to you this mixture in comedy? Don't you see that it was designed to make it easier to persuade you that there is such a mixture in fear and love and other cases? I hoped that once you had accepted this you would release me from a protracted discussion of the rest. Once the main point was understood, that there exists the possibility for the body without the soul, for the soul without the body, and for both of them in a joint affection, to contain a mixture of pleasure and pain. Now, tell me whether you will let me go now, or whether you will keep us up till midnight. One further remark will gain me my release, I hope. I will gladly give you a full account of the rest tomorrow. But for now I want to steer towards the remaining points needed to make the decision Philebus demands of us. Well spoken, Socrates. Discuss the rest any way you like. It seems natural somehow that we must proceed from the mixed pleasures to the discussion of the unmixed ones. A very good point. I will now try to explain them in turn. Although I am not really in agreement with those who hold that all pleasures are merely release from pain, I nevertheless treat them as witnesses, as I said before, to prove that there are certain kinds that only seem to be pleasures, but are not so in reality, and, furthermore, that there are others that have the appearance of enormous size and great variety, but which are in truth commingled with pain or with respite from severe pain suffered by soul and body. But, Socrates, what are the kinds of pleasures that one could rightly regard as true? Those that are related to so-called pure colours and to shapes, and to most smells and sounds, and in general all those that are based on imperceptible and painless lacks, while their fulfilments are perceptible and pleasant. But really, Socrates, what are you talking about? What I am saying may not be entirely clear straight away, but I'll try to clarify it. By the beauty of a shape, I do not mean what the many might presuppose, namely that of a living being or of a picture. What I mean, what the argument demands, is rather something straight or round, or what is constructed out of these with a compass, rule, and square, such as plain figures and solids. Those things, I take it, are not beautiful in a relative sense, as others are, but are by their very nature forever beautiful by themselves. They provide their own specific pleasures that are not at all comparable to those of rubbing, and colours are beautiful in an analogous way, and import their own kinds of pleasures. Do we now understand it better, or how do you feel? I am really trying to understand, Socrates, but will you also try to say this more clearly? What I am saying is that those among the smooth and bright sounds that produce one pure note are not beautiful in relation to anything else, but in and by themselves, and that they are accompanied by their own pleasures, which belong to them by nature. That much is true. Then there is also the less divine tribe of pleasures connected with smells. But because there is no inevitable pain mixed with them, in whatever way or wherever we may come by them, for this reason I regard them as the counterpart to those others. So, if you get my point, we will then treat those as two species of the kinds of pleasures we are looking for. I do get your point. Then let us also add to these the pleasures of learning, if indeed we are agreed that there is no such thing as hunger for learning connected with them, nor any pains that have their source in a hunger for learning. Here too I agree with you. Well then, if after such filling with knowledge people lose it again through forgetting, do you notice any kinds of pain? None that could be called inherent by nature, but in our reflections on this loss when we need it, we experience it as a painful loss. But, my dear, we are here concerned only with the natural affections themselves, apart from reflection on them. Then you are right in saying that the lapse of knowledge never causes us any pain. Then we may say that the pleasures of learning are unmixed with pain and belong not to the masses but only to a very few. How could one fail to agree? But now that we have properly separated the pure pleasures and those that can rightly be called impure, let's add to our account the attribution of immoderation to the violent pleasures, but moderation in contrast to the others. That is to say, we will assign those pleasures which display high intensity and violence, no matter whether frequently or rarely, to the class of the unlimited, the more and less, which affects both body and soul. The other kinds of pleasures we will assign to the class of things that possess measurement. Quite right, Socrates. But we have also to look into the following question about them. What question? The question of their relation to truth. What is closer to it, the pure, unadulterated, and sufficient, or the violent, multiform, and enormous? Just what are you after in asking this question, Socrates? I want to omit nothing in the investigation of both pleasure and knowledge. I want to ask if one part of them is pure and other impure, so that both of them may come to trial in their pure form, and so make it easier for you and me and all those present to come to a verdict in this trial. Quite right. Then let us go on and see whether all items that belong in the pure kind display the following qualification, but let us first pick out one of them and study it. Which one shall we choose? Let us take whiteness first, if you have no objection. That is fine with me. Now, how can there be purity in the case of whiteness, and what sort of thing is it? Is it the greatest quantity or amount, or is it rather the complete lack of any admixture, that is, where there is not the slightest part of any other kind contained in this colour? It will obviously be the perfectly unadulterated colour. Right. But shall we not also agree that this is the truest and the most beautiful of all instances of white, rather than what is greatest in quantity or amount? Clearly. So we are perfectly justified if we say that a small portion of pure white is to be regarded as whiter than a larger quantity of an impure whiteness, and at the same time more beautiful and possessed of more truth. Perfectly justified. Well now, we don't need to run through many more examples to justify our account of pleasure, but this example suffices to prove that in the case of pleasure too, every small and insignificant pleasure that is unadulterated by pain will turn out to be pleasanter, truer, and more beautiful than a greater quantity and amount of the impure kind. Quite definitely so, and the example is sufficient. But what about the following point? Have we not been told that pleasure is always a process of becoming, and that there is no being at all of pleasure? There are some subtle thinkers who have tried to pass on this doctrine to us, and we ought to be grateful to them. What does it mean? I will indeed try to explain it to you, my friend Protarchus, by resuming my questioning. You have only to keep on asking. Suppose there are two kinds of things, one kind sufficient to itself, the other in need of something else. How and what sort of things do you mean? The one kind by nature possesses supreme dignity, the other is inferior to it. Express this more clearly, please. We must have met handsome and noble youths together with their courageous lovers? Certainly. Now try to think of another set of two items that corresponds to this pair in all the relevant features that we just mentioned. Do I have to repeat my request for the third time? Please express more clearly what it is you want to say, Socrates. Nothing fanciful at all, Protarchus. This is just a playful manner of speaking. What is really meant is that all things are either for the sake of something else, or they are that for whose sake the other kind comes to be in each case. I finally managed to understand it, thanks to the many repetitions. Perhaps, my boy, we will understand better as the argument proceeds. No doubt. So let's take another pair. Of what kind? Take on the one hand the generation of all things, on the other their being. I also accept this pair from you, being and generation. Excellent. Now, which of the two do you think exists for the other's sake? Shall we say that generation takes place for the sake of being, or does being exist for the sake of generation? Whether what is called being is what it is for the sake of generation, is that what you want to know? Apparently. By heavens, what a question to ask me! You might as well ask, tell me, Protarchus, whether shipbuilding goes on for the sake of ships, or whether ships are for the sake of shipbuilding, or some such thing. That is precisely what I am asking about, Protarchus. What keeps you from answering your question yourself, Socrates? Nothing, providing you take your share in the argument. I am quite determined to. I hold that all ingredients, as well as all tools, and quite generally all materials, are always provided for the sake of some process of generation. I further hold that every process of generation in turn always takes place for the sake of some particular being, and that all generation taken together takes place for the sake of being as a whole. Nothing could be clearer. Now, pleasure, since it is a process of generation, necessarily comes to be for the sake of some being. Of course. But that for the sake of which what comes to be for the sake of something comes to be in each case, ought to be put into the class of the things good in themselves, while that which comes to be for the sake of something else belongs in another class, my friend. Undeniably. But if pleasure really is a process of generation, will we be placing it correctly if we put it in a class different from that of the good? That too is undeniable. It is true then, as I said at the beginning of this argument, that we ought to be grateful to the person who indicated to us that there is always only generation of pleasure, and that it has no being whatsoever. And it is obvious that he will just laugh at those who claim that pleasure is good. Certainly. But this same person will also laugh at those who find their fulfillment in the processes of generation. How so, and what sort of people are you alluding to? I'm talking of those who cure their hunger and thirst or anything else that is cured by processes of generation. They take delight in generation as a pleasure and proclaim that they would not want to live if they were not subject to hunger and thirst, and if they could not experience all the other things one might want to mention in connection with such conditions. That is very like them. But would we not all say that destruction is the opposite of generation? Necessarily. So whoever makes this choice would choose generation and destruction in preference to that third life which consists of neither pleasure nor pain, but is a life of thought in the purest degree possible. So a great absurdity seems to appear, Socrates, if we posit pleasure as good. An absurdity indeed, especially if we go on to look at it in this way. In what way? How is this not absurd? That there should be nothing good or noble in bodies or anywhere else except in the soul, but in the soul pleasure should be the only good thing, so that courage or moderation or reason, or any of the other goods belonging to the soul, would be neither good nor noble. In addition, we would have to call the person who experiences not pleasure but pain bad, while he is in pain, even if he were the best of all men. By contrast, we would have to say of whoever is pleased that the greater his pleasure whenever he is pleased, the more he excels in virtue. All that is as absurd as possible, Socrates. Now, let us not undertake to give pleasure every possible test, while going very lightly with reason and knowledge. Let us rather strike them valiantly all around to see if there is some fault anywhere. So we'll learn what is by nature purest in them, and seeing this, we can use the truest parts of these as well as of pleasure to make our joint decision. Fair enough? Among the disciplines to do with knowledge, one part is productive, the other concerned with education and nurture, right? Just so. But let us first find out whether within the manual arts there is one side more closely related to knowledge itself, the other less closely. Secondly, whether we should treat the one as quite pure as far as it goes, the other as less pure. That is what we ought to do. So let us sort out the leading disciplines among them. Which disciplines, and how are we to do it? If someone were to take away all counting, measuring, and weighing from the arts and crafts, the rest might be said to be worthless. Worthless indeed. All we would have left would be conjecture and the training of our senses through experience and routine. We would have to rely on our ability to make the lucky guesses that many people call art, once it has acquired some proficiency through practice and hard work. Undeniably so. This is clear to start with in the case of flute playing. The harmonies are found not by measurement, but by the hit and miss of training, and quite generally music tries to find the measure by observing the vibrating strings. So there is a lot of imprecision mixed up in it, and very little reliability. Very true. And will we not discover that medicine, agriculture, navigation, and strategy are in the same condition? Definitely. But as to building, I believe that it owes its superior level of craftsmanship over other disciplines to its frequent use of measures and instruments which give it high accuracy. In what way? In shipbuilding and house building, but also in many other woodworking crafts, for it employs straight edge and compass as well as a mason's rule, a line, and an ingenious gadget called a carpenter's square. You are quite right, Socrates. Let us then divide the so-called arts into two parts, those like music, with less precision in their practice, and those like building, with more precision. Agreed. And let's take those among them as most accurate that we called primary just now. I suppose you mean arithmetic and the other disciplines you mentioned after it. That's right, but don't you think we have to admit that they too fall into two kinds, Protarchus? What two kinds do you mean? Don't we have to agree first that the arithmetic of the many is one thing, and the philosopher's arithmetic is quite another? How could anyone distinguish these two kinds of arithmetic? The difference is by no means small, Protarchus. First, there are those who compute sums of quite unequal units, such as two armies or two herds of cattle, regardless whether they are tiny or huge. But then there are the others who would not follow their example unless it were guaranteed that none of those infinitely many units differed in the least from any of the others. You explain very well the notable difference among those who make numbers their concern, so it stands to reason that there are those two different kinds of arithmetic. Well then, what about the art of calculating and measuring as builders and merchants use them, and the geometry and calculations practised by philosophers? Shall we say there is one sort of each of them or two? Going by what was said before, I ought to vote for the option that they are two of each sort. Right, but do you realize why we have brought up this question here? Possibly, but I would appreciate it if you answered the question yourself. The aim of our discussion now seems to be, just as it was when we first set out, to find an analogue here to the point we made about pleasure. So now we ought to find out whether there is a difference in purity between different kinds of knowledge in the same way as there was between different kinds of pleasures. This obviously was the purpose of our present question. But what next? Have we not discovered before that different subject matters require different arts, and that they have different degrees of certainty? Yes, we did. It is questionable, then, whether an art that goes under one name and is commonly treated as one should not rather be treated as two, depending on the difference in certainty and purity. And if this is so, we must also ask whether the art has more precision in the hands of the philosopher than its counterpart in the hands of the non-philosopher. That is indeed the question here. So what answer shall we give to it, Protarchus? Socrates, we have come across an amazing difference between the sciences as far as precision is concerned. Will that facilitate our answer? Obviously, and let it be said that these sciences are far superior to the other disciplines, but that those among them that are animated by the spirit of the true philosophers are infinitely superior yet in precision and truth in their use of measure and number. Let us settle for this doctrine, and trusting you, we will confidently answer those powerful makers of word traps. What answer shall we give them? That there are two kinds of arithmetic and two kinds of geometry, and a great many other sciences following in their lead, which have the same twofold nature, while sharing one name. Let us give our answer with best wishes to those powerful people, as you call them, Socrates. Do we maintain that these kinds of sciences are the most precise? Certainly. But the power of dialectic would repudiate us if we put any other science ahead of her. What science do we mean by that again? Clearly everybody would know what science I am referring to now, for I take it that anyone with any share in reason at all would consider the discipline concerned with being, and with what is really and for ever in every way eternally self-same, by far the truest of all kinds of knowledge. But what is your position? How would you decide this question, Protarchus? On many occasions, Socrates, I have heard Gorgias insist that the art of persuasion is superior to all others, because it enslaves all the rest, with their own consent, not by force, and is therefore by far the best of all the arts. Now I am reluctant to take up a position against either him or you. I suspect that at first you wanted to say, take up arms, but then suppressed it in embarrassment. You may take this whatever way pleases you. But I am to blame for a misunderstanding on your part. In what respect? What I wanted to find out here, my dear friend Protarchus, was not what art or science excels all others by its grandeur, by its nobility, or by its usefulness to us. Our concern here was rather to find which one aims for clarity, precision, and the highest degree of truth, even if it is a minor discipline, and our benefit is small. Look at it this way. You can avoid making an enemy of Gorgias so long as you let his art win as far as the actual profit for human life is concerned. But as to the discipline I am talking about now, what I said earlier about the white also applies in this case. Even in a small quantity it can be superior in purity and truth to what is large in quantity, but impure and untrue. We must look for this science without concern for its actual benefit or its prestige, but see whether it is by its nature a capacity in our soul to love the truth and to do everything for its sake. And if thorough reflection and sufficient discussion confirms this for our part, then we can say that it is most likely to possess purity of mind and reason. Otherwise we would have to look for a higher kind of knowledge than this. Well, thinking it over, I agree that it would be difficult to find any other kind of art or any other science that is closer to the truth than this one. When you gave this answer now, did you realize that most of the arts and sciences and those who work at them are in the first place only concerned with opinions and make opinions the center of their search? For even if they think they are studying nature, you must realize that all their lives they are merely dealing with this world order, how it came to be, how it is affected, and how it acts. Is that our position or not? Quite so. So such a person assumes the task of dealing not with things eternal, but with what comes to be, will come to be, or has come to be, undeniably. So how could we assert anything definite about these matters with exact truth if it never did possess, nor will possess, nor now possesses any kind of sameness? Impossible. And how could we ever hope to achieve any kind of certainty about subject matters that do not in themselves possess any certainty? I see no way. Then there can be no reason or knowledge that attains the highest truth about these subjects. At least it does not seem likely. We must therefore dismiss entirely you and me and also Gorgias and Philebus, but must make this declaration about our investigation. What declaration? Either we will find certainty, purity, truth, and what we may call integrity among the things that are forever in the same state, without anything mixed in it, or we will find it in what comes as close as possible to it. Everything else has to be called second-rate and inferior. Very true. Would not strict justice demand that we call the noblest things by the noblest names? That's only fair. And aren't reason and knowledge names that deserve the highest honour? Yes. So, in the most accurate sense and appropriate use, they are applied to insights into true reality. Definitely. But these were the very names that I put forward at the beginning for our verdict. The very ones, Socrates. Good. But as to the mixture of intelligence and pleasure, if one likened our situation to that of builders with ingredients or materials to use in construction, this would be a fitting comparison. Very fitting. So next we ought to try our hands at the mixture. Definitely. But had we not better repeat and remind ourselves of certain points? What are they? Those we kept reminding ourselves of before. The proverb fits well here that says that good things deserve repeating twice or even thrice. Definitely. On then, by the heavens, this is, I think, the general drift of what we said. What was it? Philebus says that pleasure is the right aim for all living beings, and that all should try to strive for it, that it is at the same time the good for all things, so that good and pleasant are but two names that really belong to what is by nature one and the same. Socrates, by contrast, affirms that these are not one and the same thing, but two, just as they are two in name, that the good and the pleasant have a different nature, and that intelligence has a greater share in the good than pleasure. Isn't that the matter at issue now, just as it was before, Protarchus? Very much so. And are we also agreed on this point now, just as we were before? What point? That the difference between the nature of the good and everything else is this. What is it? Any creature that was in permanent possession of it, entirely and in every way, would never be in need of anything else, but would live in perfect self-sufficiency. Is that right? It is right. But didn't we try to give them a separate trial in our discussion, assigning each of them a life of its own, so that pleasure would remain unmixed with intelligence, and again, intelligence would not have the tiniest bit of pleasure? That's what we did. Did either of the two seem to us self-sufficient at that time for anyone? How could it? If some mistake was made then, anyone now has the opportunity to take it up again and correct it. Let him put memory, intelligence, knowledge, and the true opinion into one class, and ask himself whether anybody would choose to possess or acquire anything else without that class. Most particularly, whether he would want pleasure as much and as intensive as it can be, without the true opinion that he enjoys it, without recognizing what kind of experience it is he has, without memory of this affection for any length of time. And let him put reason to the same test, whether anyone would prefer to have it without any kind of pleasure, even a very short-lived one, rather than with some pleasures, provided that he does not want all pleasures without intelligence, rather than with some fraction of it. Neither of them will do, Socrates, and there is no need to raise the same question so often. So neither of these two would be perfect, worthy of choice for all, and the supreme good. How could they? The good, therefore, must be taken up precisely, or at least in outline, so that, as we said before, we know to whom we will give the second prize. You are right. Have we not discovered at least the road that leads towards the good? What road? It's as if, when you are looking for somebody, you first find out where he actually lives. That would be a major step towards finding him, no doubt. Similarly here, there is this argument which has now indicated to us, just as it did at the beginning of our discussion, that we ought not to seek the good in the unmixed life, but in the mixed one. Quite. But there is more hope that what we are looking for will show itself in a well mixed life rather than in a poorly mixed one. Much more. So let us pray to the gods for assistance when we perform our mixture, Protarchus, whether it be Dionysus or Hephaestus or any other deity who is in charge of presiding over such mixtures. By all means. We stand like cup-bearers before the fountains, the fountain of pleasure, comparable to honey, and the sobering fountain of intelligence, free of wine, like sober, healthy water, and we have to see how to make a perfect mixture of the two. Certainly. But let's look first into this. Will our mixture be as good as it can be if we mix every kind of pleasure with every kind of intelligence? Maybe. It is not without risk, however, but now I have an idea how we might procure a safer mixture. Tell us what it is. Didn't we find that one pleasure turned out to be truer than another, just as one art was more precise than another? Definitely. But there was also a difference between different sciences, since one kind deals with a subject matter that comes to be and perishes, the other is concerned with what is free of that, the eternal and self-same. Since we made truth our criterion, the latter kind appeared to be the truer one. That was certainly so. If we took from each sort the segments that possess most truth and mixed them together, would this mixture provide us with the most desirable life, or would we also need less true ones? We should do it this way, it seems to me. Suppose, then, there is a person who understands what justice itself is, and can give the appropriate definitions, and possesses the same kind of comprehension about all the rest of what there is. Let that be presupposed. Will he be sufficiently versed in science if he knows the definition of the circle and of the divine sphere itself, but cannot recognize the human sphere, and these our circles, using even in house building those other yardsticks and those circles? We would find ourselves in a rather ridiculous position if we were confined entirely to those divine kinds of knowledge, Socrates. What are you saying? Ought we at the same time to include the inexact and impure science of the false yardstick and circle, and add it to the mixture? Yes, necessarily so, if any one of us ever wants to find his own way home. But what about music? Ought we also to mix in the kind of which we said a little earlier, that it is full of lucky hits and imitation, but lacks purity? It seems necessary to me, if in fact our life is supposed to be at least some sort of life. Do you want me, then, to yield like a doorkeeper to the pushing and shoving of a crowd, and to throw open the doors, and let the flood of all sorts of knowledge in, the inferior kind mingling with the pure? I, for my part, can't see what damage it would do to accept all the other kinds of knowledge, as long as we have those of the highest kind. Shall I, then, let the lot of them flow into the vessel like Homer's very poetical commingling of mountain glens? Absolutely. In they go. But now we have to return again to the fountain of pleasure. We cannot any longer carry out our original intention of first mixing only the true parts of each of them together. Our love for every kind of knowledge has made us let them all in together, before any of the pleasures. What you say is true. Now it is time for us to decide about pleasures too, whether we ought to admit the whole tribe in their cases, or whether we should at first admit the true ones only. It is much safer, if we let the true in first. Let them in then. But what next? If some turn out to be necessary, should we not mix them in also as we did in the other case? No reason why not, at least if they really are necessary. But having decided that it was innocuous or even beneficial to spend our lives in the pursuit of all the arts and crafts, we may now come to the same conclusion about the pleasures. If it is beneficial and harmless to live our lives enjoying all the pleasures, then we should mix them all in. So what are we to say in their case, and what are we to do? We should not turn to ourselves with this question, Protarchus, but to the pleasures themselves as well as to the different kinds of knowledge, and find out how they feel about each other by putting the question in this way. What way? My friends, whether you ought to be called pleasures or some other name. Would you prefer to live together with every kind of knowledge, or rather to live without it entirely? To this I think they cannot help giving this answer. What answer? What has been said already. It is neither possible nor beneficial for one tribe to remain alone in isolation and unmixed. We would prefer to live side by side with that best kind of knowledge, the kind that understands not only all other things, but also each one of us, as far as that is possible. An excellent answer, we will reply to them. With justice. But after that we have to raise the question with intelligence and reason. Do you have any need for any association with the pleasures? That is how we would address reason and knowledge. What kinds of pleasures they might ask in return? Very likely. Our discussion would then continue as follows. Will you have any need to associate with the strongest and most intensive pleasures in addition to the true pleasures? We will ask them. Why on earth should we need them, Socrates? They might reply. They are a tremendous impediment to us, since they infect the souls in which they dwell with madness, or even prevent our own development altogether. Furthermore, they totally destroy most of our offspring, since neglect leads to forgetfulness. But as to the true and pure pleasures you mentioned, those regard as our kin. And besides, also add the pleasures of health and of temperance, and all those that commit themselves to virtue as to their deity, and follow it around everywhere. But to forge an association between reason and those pleasures that are forever involved with foolishness and other kinds of vice would be totally unreasonable for anyone who aims at the best and most stable mixture or blend. This is true particularly if he wants to discover in this mixture what the good is in man and in the universe, and to get some vision of the nature of the good itself. When reason makes this defence for herself as well as for memory and right opinion, shall we not admit that she has spoken reasonably and in accord with her own standards? Absolutely. But see whether the following is also necessary, and without it not a single thing could come to be. What is it? Wherever we do not mix in truth, nothing could truly come to be, nor remain in existence once it had come to be. How should it? In no way. But now, if there is anything else missing in our mixture, it is up to you and Philebus to say so. To me, at least, it seems that our discussion has arrived at the design of what might be called an incorporeal order that rules harmoniously over a body possessed by a soul. Count me as one who shares that opinion, Socrates. Would there be some justification to our claim that we are by now standing on the very threshold of the good and of the house of every member of its family? It would seem so, to me at least. What ingredient in the mixture ought we to regard as the most valuable, and at the same time as the factor that makes it precious to all mankind? Once we have found it, we will inquire further whether it is more closely related and akin to pleasure or to reason in nature as a whole. You are right. This would certainly be very useful in bringing us closer to our final verdict. But it is certainly not difficult to see what factor in each mixture it is that makes it either most valuable or worth nothing at all. What do you mean? There is not a single human being who does not know it. Know what? that any kind of mixture that does not in some way or other possess measure or the nature of proportion will necessarily corrupt its ingredients and most of all itself. For there would be no blending in such cases at all, but really an unconnected medley, the ruin of whatever happens to be contained in it. Very true. But now we notice that the force of the good has taken refuge in an alliance with the nature of the beautiful, for measure and proportion manifest themselves in all areas as beauty and virtue. Undeniably. But we did say that truth is also included along with them in our mixture. Indeed. Well then, if we cannot capture the good in one form, we will have to take hold of it in a conjunction of three: beauty, proportion, and truth. Let us affirm that these things should by right be treated as a unity, and be held responsible for what is in the mixture, for its goodness is what makes the mixture itself a good one. Very well stated. Anyone should by now be able to judge between pleasure and intelligence, which of the two is more closely related to the supreme good, and more valuable among gods and men. Even if it is obvious, it is better to make it explicit in our discussion. So now let us judge each one of the three in relation to pleasure and reason, for we have to see for which of those two we want to grant closer kinship to each of them. You mean to beauty, truth, and measure? Yes. Take up truth first, Protarchus, and holding it in front of you, look at all three: reason, truth, and pleasure. Then, after withholding judgment for a long time, give your answer whether for you pleasure or reason is more akin to truth. What need is there for any length of time? I think there is an enormous difference, for pleasure is the greatest impostor of all, by general account, and in connection with the pleasures of love, which seem to be the greatest of all, even perjury is pardoned by the gods. Pleasures are perhaps rather like children, who do not possess the least bit of reason. Reason, by contrast, either is the same as truth, or of all things it is the most like it and most true. Next, look at measure in the same way, and see whether pleasure possesses more of it than intelligence, or intelligence more than pleasure. Once again you are setting me a task I am well prepared for. I don't think that one could find anything that is more outside all measure than pleasure and excessive joy, while nothing more measured than reason and knowledge could ever be found. Well argued. But now go on to the third criterion. Does reason contain more beauty than the tribe of pleasures in our estimate, so that reason is more beautiful than pleasure, or is it the other way round? Why, Socrates, no one awake or dreaming could ever see intelligence and reason to be ugly. No one could ever have conceived of them as becoming or being ugly, or that they ever will be. Right. In the case of pleasures, by contrast, when we see anyone actively engaged in them, especially those that are most intense, we notice that their effect is quite ridiculous, if not outright obscene. We become quite ashamed ourselves and hide them as much as possible from sight, and we confine such activities to the night, as if daylight must not witness such things. So you will announce everywhere, both by sending messengers and saying it in person to those present, that pleasure is not a property of the first rank, nor again of the second, but that the first comes what is somehow connected with measure, the measured and the timely, and whatever else is to be considered similar. That seems at least to be the upshot of our discussion now. The second rank goes to the well-proportioned and beautiful, the perfect, the self-sufficient, and whatever else belongs in that family. That seems right. If you give the third rank, as I divine, to reason and intelligence, you cannot stray far from the truth. Perhaps. Nor again if, besides these three, you give fourth place to those things that we defined as the soul's own properties, to the sciences and the arts, and what we called right opinions, since they are most closely related to the good than pleasure at least. Maybe so. The fifth kind will be those pleasures we set apart and defined as painless. We call them the soul's own pure pleasures, since they are attached to the sciences, some of them even to sense perception. Perhaps. With the sixth generation the well-ordered song may find its end, says Orpheus. So it seems that our discussion too has found its end at the determination of the sixth ranking. There remains nothing further to do for us except to give a final touch to what has been said. We have to do that. Come on then. The third libation goes to Zeus the Saviour. Let us call the same argument to witness for the third time. Which one? Philebus declares that every pleasure of any kind is the good. By the third libation you appear to mean, as you just stated, that we have to repeat the argument all over from the beginning. Yes, but let's also hear what follows, in view of all the considerations laid out here, and out of distaste for Philebus's position pronounced by countless others on many occasions, I maintain that reason is far superior to pleasure and more beneficial for human life. That is correct. Suspecting that there are many other goods, I said that if something turned out to be better than these two, then I would fight on the side of reason for the second prize against pleasure, so that pleasure would be deprived even on the second rank. You did say that. Afterwards it became most sufficiently clear that neither of those two would suffice. Very true. And did it not become clear at this point in our discussion that both reason and pleasure had lost any claim that one or the other would be the good itself, since they were lacking in autonomy and in the power of self-sufficiency and perfection? Exactly. Then, when a third competitor showed up, superior to either of them, it became apparent that reason was infinitely more closely related and akin to the character of the victor. Undeniably. And did not pleasure turn out to receive fifth position, according to the verdict we reached in our discussion? Apparently. But not first place, even if all the cattle and horses and the rest of the animals gave testimony by following pleasure. Now many people accept their testimony, as the seers do that of the birds, and judge that pleasures are most effective in securing the happy life. They even believe that the animal passions are more authoritative witnesses than is the love of argument that is constantly revealed under the guidance of the philosophic muse. We are all agreed now that what you said is as true as possible, Socrates. So will you let me go now? There is a little missing, Socrates. Surely you will not give up before we do, but I will remind you of what is left.